Hello everybody, and welcome to my channel. It's been a minute, and I do apologize. So the title of today's video is The Beatles and the Stones. Not the Beatles versus the Stones. The Beatles and the Stones. The "and" is important. Several weeks back, Paul McCartney gave an interview with Howard Stern, as he usually does. And he and Howard always have back and forths together. They know each other, they are friendly with each other. And Howard asked him the typical question, who was better, the Beatles or the Stones? And Paul said, and I'm paraphrasing it here a bit, you could find the video on YouTube, the Beatles were better, but I love the Stones. The Stones' music is rooted in the blues, and we have a lot more influences and things like that. And of course the media always has to play up this so-called feud of the Beatles and the Stones, when there never was a feud between the Beatles and the Stones. But immediately they reach out to Mick Jagger for a quote. And Jagger basically says, and I'm paraphrasing it here, I'll try and find a link to it, and I'll link it in the description if I can find the actual link. It's out there on the internets. But Jagger said, I love Paul. He's a sweetheart. I'm a politician. And then he went on to say that there was never any competition between the Beatles and the Stones. But then he talked about the differences between the Beatles and the Stones, the big difference between the Beatles and the Stones. And I thought for a second, and I kind of agreed with him. The Stones started to tour, go on big tours as the arena stadium concert tours, they really started to take off. Now I know a lot of my fellow Beatlemaniacs had reached out to me and said, what, Shea Stadium was not an arena concert? Candlestick Park? Comiskey Park in Chicago? Those weren't stadiums? They were stadiums, but I get what Mick Jagger is saying. The Beatles never took advantage of what was popular in the beginning in '69, I would say possibly with the Rolling Stones. And then Zeppelin in the 70s, and the Stones in the 70s, and the Who. These big spectacle concerts where the sound was great. The Beatles never played Madison Square Garden. The Stones played Madison Square Garden. Zeppelin did. All four Beatles played Madison Square Garden, but not as the Beatles. I mean, George and Ringo were at Madison Square Garden for a concert for Bangladesh. George played Madison Square Garden on his '74 tour. John played Madison Square Garden on the one-to-one benefit concert. And Paul has played Madison Square Garden several times. But the Beatles never had that where the audience got to be up close to hear them, where the sound was perfect. The audience heard them, and the Beatles heard themselves, with the exception of this Atlanta, Georgia concert in 1965, where the sound engineer was this innovative guy who gave the Beatles monitors, and you hear them, it's on YouTube, on the bootleg, saying, oh my gosh, I could hear. But other than that, the Beatles were Shea Stadium. The audience wasn't on the field with seats. They were in the stands. The sound was being piped through the stadium PA system. And the Beatles looked like this when you were in the front row. 1969 was the year the Stones went on this real big American tour. 1969, I will say, despite the fact that Abbey Road came out that year, that really was the year for the Rolling Stones. That was the year they finally emerged from the Beatles' shadow, you could say, and really came into their own. Granted, they had great songs before, but they recorded a brilliant album. In my opinion, it's the masterpiece. Yes, I love Sticky Fingers. Yes, I love Exile on Main Street. But to me, Let It Bleed is a masterpiece from beginning to end, a real cohesive album. The Stones were taking some chances there. They had the free concert in Hyde Park, which was to celebrate the life of Brian Jones, as well as to introduce the world to their new guitar player, Mick Taylor. King Crimson was at that concert. I think Pink Floyd was at that concert too. I could be wrong. But they had this big free concert in Hyde Park. And they went on this big American tour. Now, granted, the tour culminated in the Altamont Speedway free concert in December of 1969, and we all know what happened there. That's another video that I will talk about at some point. But 69 was the year the Stones really came into their own. And then the 72 World Tour, which was filled with debauchery, and the Stones that we come to know and celebrate as the bad boys, that was really the tour where they were the bad boys. The Beatles and the Stones, I need them both in my life. Granted, the Beatles with me are an obsession, but the Stones are my top 10 favorite bands of all time, you know? I need them both. Now, granted, if I had to choose between the Beatles and the Stones to bring on a desert island, a catalog to bring on the desert island, I'll bring the Beatles. That's my number one obsession. I mean, I won't even bring Pink Floyd, and they're my number 2 obsession. But the Stones are in my top 10. I need the Stones in my life. They were different bands, but they were friends. Now, there's a few people I know who are just diehard Stones fans and don't have time for the Beatles. And some people have made this stupid argument to me that the Beatles were technically a boy band. Well, so were the Stones. The Stones were gracing the cover of teen magazines as well. And, the Beatles sold out when Brian Epstein put them in suits and got them out of their hard, leather pants and leather jackets. He put them in suits, taught them to be more professional on stage, taught them to stop swearing on stage and eating on stage too, The Beatles came from Liverpool, which was this hard-hitting seaside town. There's nothing in Liverpool. Who wants to be in Liverpool? Granted, nowadays it's such a great city, but everybody wants to be in London, and the Stones came from London, Even Lemmy from Motorhead brought that up because he was a big Beatle fan, believe it or not. He said the Stones were from London. It was the Beatles who were from the working class Liverpool and all. My poor Lemmy imitation. The Stones were from London, but they quickly became friends. Andrew Loog Oldham, who managed them, was Brian Epstein's assistant when he started to manage the Beatles. He saw the Stones and he started to manage them. And it was George Harrison who basically told Dick Rowe of Decca Records, the man who turned down the Beatles, that he needs to sign the Rolling Stones. And lo and behold, he did. And really, the Stones were basically... Andrew Loog Oldham was going to try and market them as the lovable, cute mop tops from the South. Couldn't get them arrested until he wrote the article, "Would You Let Your Daughter Date a Rolling Stone?" which is now marketing that these guys were the down and dirty bad boys as opposed to the Beatles' lovable mop tops. It was marketing, is what it was. Brilliant marketing. The Stones didn't even write their own songs when he was managing them. And Keith sort of confirmed this in his autobiography, that they had never had any intention of writing their own songs. Andrew Loog Oldham basically locked Keith and Mick in a room and said, "Don't come out until you write a song." And they came out with As Tears Go By, which I believe was the first song they wrote. I mean, there were a couple of attempts, like Tell Me on the first album, which is a damn good tune. But the Beatles and the Stones, there's no rivalry there. They were friends. Keith even says it in 25 by 5. That they were sort of a double act. They would each call each other up and said, "How's your new single coming along?" "Oh, we're about to release ours. How's yours?" "Oh, we still have some mixing." "Okay, we'll go ahead and release ours." And okay, great. We'll hold ours back. And in fact, if the Beatles had any sort of a rival, any band really pointed their finger at the Beatles and called them out, it was the Dave Clark Five. All you got to do is take a look at the liner notes of the American edition of their first album. I think it's Glad All Over. Right there. It was this song right here that knocked those shaggy, long-haired four off the top. Something like that, but it was really... Even the American edition of the album, of the soundtrack to their first and only movie, Having a Wild Weekend in America... Catch Us If You Can in England. Directed by the great John Borman, by the way. And even the liner notes of that, the songs in the movie are showstoppers, but not in the traditional movie sense. I'm paraphrasing it here. The songs serve as the background score to a powerful movie, something like that. In other words, it's basically giving a middle finger to A Hard Day's Night. And even later on down the line, when everybody was getting all psychedelic, the Dave Clark Five, one of the reasons why they couldn't stay on was because they couldn't. They they couldn't actually maintain that. There's a song that they did called, I think it's called Sitting on a Cloud or Standing on a Cloud, something like that, where Mike Smith, the lead singer and organ player, sardonically goes, "All you need is love." So it was the Dave Clark Five who were really calling the Beatles out. The Stones and the Beatles, what you people want to call a feud, it's, to me, a gentle ribbing that friends give each other. They know where they're at. That's the way I get it, you know? There's not a rivalry. And as far as the Beatles versus the Stones, I say the Beatles and the Stones. I need them both in my life. They both fulfill a need in me for different reasons, you know? I always say that the Stones could not have made a bad album until After Some Girls. Granted, I love Emotional Rescue. It's some of the newer albums that I have issues with. But that's sort of my take. There really isn't a feud between the Beatles and the Stones. I wish the media would stop trying to get a feud going between them and then calling it a feud when it's just a gentle, friends teasing each other is what it is. That's the way I've always taken it. And that's the way I still take it, you know? The Beatles and the Stones, I need them both in my life. There you go. And I'll talk to you soon.